Ian, more bad news. Or good news. Take these things how you will, I don't have time anymore. There's a purge going on about the pavilion. The whole West Wing is to be quarantined and dedicated to positive cases of the virus. All non-high-risk patients are to be released, but when you've got 30 or 40 such beds to free up in 24 hours, non-high risk becomes an incredibly malleable term. Many of these patients are simply being pushed out the double doors. Even if they have next of kin, they have nobody who can come to get them. We're sending them out into open-air gas chambers, and there's nothing I can do about it. Vernon is doing fine. Stupendous, even. Frankly, he's been a boon for our purging process. In all my years, I've never been able to bring comfort to my patients, even those with the most mild neuroses, as your father can. Indeed, if it weren't totally impossible, as most discoveries involving your father proved to be, I would say he had veritably cured them, casting demons out of them and into, I hope, some swine other than myself. Your father is a miracle worker, perhaps. Parenthetical, this is my attempt at humor. But, then, we know this is not your father. You know that. This is someone else, some kind of messiah who has chosen your father's skin. Of course I would never do this, but I have half a mind to deliberately expose your father, secret him into the quarantine wing somehow, and see how many other cures Vernon Spatunia can divine. Your good friend, Hermes.
Less than a month ago, Santa Mara was like any other town, people with nothing but problems. Then out of the sky came a solution.
So that's how it began. Out of the sky.
Good evening, guys and ghouls, and welcome back to Monster Craze Memoirs, a generational podcast about B-movies. I am your host, Ian Garcia. Film historians typically identify the late 20s through the mid-50s as the golden age of Hollywood. It was in this period that motion picture production and distribution in North America had become consolidated under the hegemony of the 5 major studios whose names are still recognized to this day, albeit as bastardized subsidiary banners of multimedia and international conglomerates. These 5 majors were Metro-Goldwyn-Mayer, Warner Brothers, RKO Pictures, Paramount Pictures, and 20th Century Fox. Just below these big 5 majors were the 3 little majors, mostly specializing in moderately budgeted features and short subjects. These were Universal Pictures, Columbia Pictures, and United Artists. Even further below these major studios were low-budget outfits that were frequently described derisively by their major competitors as the Poverty Row. Most of these studios rose up in the shadow of major Hollywood in the 1920s, but folded rather quickly and virtually disappeared as a commercial phenomenon by the 40s. These companies included CBC Productions, a precursor to Columbia, one of the few Poverty Row outfits to ascend the economic ladder. Tiffany Pictures from 1921 to 1932, Larry Darmore Productions from 1931 to 1949, Grand National Films Incorporated from 36 to 39, Producers Release Incorporation from 39 to 46. You get the picture. Things that studios you never hear about anymore, even if you're an avid film connoisseur and historian. The most successful of these studios were Republic Pictures, actually a consolidation of several previously established Poverty Row companies, and Monogram Pictures. These studios, while largely operating under the same contract system that was typical of classical Hollywood, tended to specialize in the lowest budget features, particularly Western and crime films, as well as short subjects, as well as packaging and releasing productions by independent producers. By the mid-50s, as I am wont to repeat ad nauseum, the hegemony of the major studio contract system was in sharp decline, owing to a combination of the 1948 Paramount decision limiting or altogether stripping the majors of their monopolistic practices, and competition from the consumer television market. In this context, while most Poverty Row studios were utterly destroyed by the Paramount decision, unable to compete and survive without their own vertically integrated distribution networks, two of them, the Consolidated Republic and the stalwart Monogram Pictures, as well as regionally independent companies, began to flourish. In general, models of film production and distribution moved by necessity away from in-house productions and vertical integration to the contracting and co-financing of independent producers, studios, and startup companies to develop and produce products that were tailored narrowly to more specific markets. The prime demographic of this post-war period, of course, became the baby boom generation, whose greater leisure time, social independence, and disposable allowances proved especially reliable for these purveyors of crime movies, westerns, and, increasingly throughout the 50s, modern science fiction and horror. Monogram Pictures had operated on the fringes of Hollywood since 1931, itself the result of a merger between W. Ray Johnston's Ray Art Productions and Trem Carr's Sono Art Worldwide Pictures. By 1935, Monogram itself ended up being consolidated into Republic, but unable to establish a good working relationship with studio head Herbert Yates, the pair pulled out, Carr moving on to work for Universal, and Johnston reactivating Monogram in 1937. By 1945, administration of Monogram had changed over to one Steve Broidy. At that time, Broidy's assistant was future producer Walter Mirisch, who would go on to establish his own independent production company, the Mirisch Company, in 1957. Mirisch and his company would form an especially fortuitous relationship with United Artists, producing some of that studio's biggest hits from the late 50s well into the period of New Hollywood. These included Billy Wilder's Some Like It Hot, The Apartment, John Sturges's The Magnificent Seven, and then The Great Escape, screen adaptations of West Side Story and Fiddler on the Roof, Blake Edwards' The Pink Panther, and Norman Jewison's In the Heat of the Night and The Thomas Crown Affair. In 1945, however, Mirisch was still just a Harvard Business School graduate in his 20s with a clear eye for the future and the ear of a hungry Steve Broidy. Perhaps anticipating the death knell of the Paramount decision or just reading the writing on the wall, Mirisch was able to convince Broidy that the days of Poverty Row Hollywood were effectively kaput. Rather than continuing to subsist on a lean diet of lowest common denominator, Monogram should do what Columbia had done before it and invest more in producing quality films, in quotes, that could balance the studio's portfolio and boost its reputation both inside of Hollywood and to the general consumer public. Broidy approved the creation of a new unit of Monogram, with Mirisch as its production head that would specialize in what Mirisch himself dubbed B-plus pictures, higher budget productions that would employ more prestigious or creative and less traditional subject matter to complement Monogram's standard fare. In a clear derivation of United Artists, this unit was called Allied Artists Studios. By 1953, the monogram name was retired entirely, and the studio was henceforth known as Allied Artists Pictures Corporation. The former Poverty Row outfit's ambitious attempts to go legitimate, as it were, throughout the 50s and 60s were disappointing, to say the least. While they had survived the Paramount Decree reckoning, Allied Artists is mainly known today as one of those little studios that just couldn't. Their most ambitious, truly big-budget projects during this period, William Wyler's Friendly Persuasion in 1956, nominated for 6 Academy Awards, including Best Picture, and Billy Wilder's Love in the Afternoon a year later, were both critical successes, but commercial flops. They invested a lot of monies in these movies, and they just did not pay back. By the mid-60s, Broidy would retire, Mirisch would be well on his way with his own company, and Allied Artists itself would primarily operate as a distributor of foreign films, and increasingly associated with exploitation cinema. During the New Hollywood period, Allied Artists' new management took a couple more stabs at prestige cinema in the form of 1972's Cabaret and 1973's Papillon. The irony is that, like their most ostensibly prestigious Big Three sibling, United Artists, the increasing production costs associated with these kinds of pictures, coupled with the runaway inflation that transpired over the course of the 70s, made these investments increasingly risky, even more risky than they had been way back in the late 40s and 50s. By 1979, Allied Artists went into bankruptcy. These days, Allied Artists is probably best known as that other studio most associated with the drive-in and double-feature cinema that was a staple of the baby boom's pop culture diet. Their first 2 forays into these horror and sci-fi specialty films, were the 3D film The Maze in 1953, directed by venerated production designer William Cameron Menzies in the same year as his more famous Invaders from Mars, as well as the very cheap alien invasion film Target Earth in 1954, a pickup of independent producer Herman Cohen's own first attempt at sci-fi before striking gold with his 4 teen horror flicks for American International Pictures 3 years later. We've covered 2 of those already, I Was a Teenage Werewolf and Invasion of the Saucermen, and next week we'll be covering the second 2, which are I Was a Teenage Frankenstein and Blood of Dracula. But Allied Artists, concentrating on them, that company's associations with low-budget horror and sci-fi, it wouldn't really begin in earnest until about 1957 or 1958. In 1956, on the other hand, the studio managed to put out 2 movies that were a decidedly higher premium than what they would go on to do, reflecting a distinct overlap between the desire to plumb a hot new genre and Walter Mirisch's push for more quality B+ kinds of motion pictures. One of these films was done entirely in studio, that was Edward Burns' World Without End, and I will note that I had previously offered World Without End as one option for a film to cover in the future free bonus episode, but apparently you sickos would rather hear me talk about Wild Guitar, so yeehaw! Okay, anyway, the other film, Allied Artists, that other B+ sci-fi picture they produced in 1956, the subject of this episode was Invasion of the Body Snatchers. Obviously, in our last Bookworms Crypt episode, we already covered Jack Finney's The Body Snatchers, so I'm not going to belabor a description of the novel and its plot here. Suffice it to say that, unlike some of the literary sources we've covered so far on this podcast, Harry Bates's Farewell to the Master, Kurt Siod Max Donovan's Brain, Paul W. Fairman's The Cosmic Frame, Finney's novel did not originate in the pages of pulp quarterlies. Rather, it was originally serialized in an abridged form in the illustrious Collier's Weekly. Now, Collier's itself was certainly not above the pulp vernacular of any period. Plenty of grimy thrillers and shockers were published in its pages over the years, and with the golden age of modern science fiction, the genre was reaching an early peak of mainstream accessibility, even prestige, but the magazine's sizable, non-exclusive readership, meaning not just sci-fi and fantasy heads read it, as well as its own legacy of serious content, including fiction, political cartooning, and investigative journalism, it certainly also informed the perceived credibility of the Body Snatchers for a similarly serious film adaptation. Enter Walter Wanger, a veteran Hollywood producer whose prestige as a filmmaker matched Collier's prestige in fiction and nonfiction literature in terms of vetting Finney's novel for serious treatment. Wanger had made a prolific career in Hollywood, beginning at Paramount in the 1920s. In those days, he was just a story man, someone whose sole job was to keep abreast of what was hot in American literature in order to help fill the Golden Age studio's massive quota of feature film products. Obviously, we only have so many screenwriters, and they can only write so many films, and these studios were producing hundreds of films a year. They needed to find sources quickly, so it was always a good thing to have storymen on your side whose, again, their sole job was just to keep abreast of literature and the theater and say, hey, this story, especially if it's a particularly successful play or book or story, hey, this could make a capital movie, I would say. His biggest contribution, that is Walter Wanger, his biggest contribution in those days in the 20s was the recommendation of Edith Maud Hull's controversial but best-selling 1919 novel The Sheik for the feature film treatment, eventually transpiring into one of the biggest hits of the early 20s that gave us Rudolph Valentino as this certified sex symbol and Latin lover in those days. But Wanger quickly grew tired of the lack of personal involvement or upward mobility he was getting at the company, and even quit the film business altogether for a time after The Sheik, only to return to Paramount in 1924 at a raised salary as an executive of the company's Astoria, New York studios. Between 1929 and 1931, he only directly produced 4 films, receiving credit on only 2 of them. By that time, the Great Depression had hit, and Wanger's contract was not renewed. He left Paramount in December with sights on establishing himself as an independent producer. He worked consistently through the 30s and the 40s, developing especially reliable relationships with United Artists and Universal. His more famous productions during this time include John Ford's Stagecoach in 1939 and Alfred Hitchcock's Foreign Correspondent in 1940. He gained a reputation as a producer who gave the screenwriters and directors he employed an atypical degree of creative freedom, and whose partnership with Little Three majors often proved amenable, in the case of Columbia's Harry Cohn, for instance, to their studio head's desire to release more prestigious films to boost the studio's credibility and prestige. Things went south for a bit in 1951, however, when Wanger, apparently under considerable psychological stress from financial setbacks on several of his productions, and suspecting that his wife, the actress Joan Bennett, was having an affair with her agent Jennings Lang, twice shot and wounded the latter in a fit of nervous rage. Charged with assault and attempt to commit murder, Wanger initially attempted to submit a temporary insanity plea before waiving his rights to a defense and throwing himself on the mercy of the court. He served 4 months at the Castaic Honor Farm before bouncing back with the belatedly released Kansas Pacific in 1953, the first of 4 films he would produce in partnership with, you guessed it, the plucky Poverty Row outfit, Allied Artists. Wanger purchased the rights to adapt The Body Snatchers in the winter of 1954, and then pitched the film to Allied Artists, who purchased exclusive distribution rights, originally agreeing to finance the film at roughly $460,000. For a director, Wanger leaned on Donald Siegel, with whom he had worked on a previous project for Allied Artists, the film noir Riot in Cell Block 11.
We'll figure out what we want, and if they don't give it to us, We'll make him a present of one dead guard. Or maybe 4.
Here it is, ripped from the blistering facts of prison riots that have stunned the nation. Riot in Cell Block 11, the true shocking story of terror behind the wall.
Siegel is best known nowadays for the films he directed in the 60s and 70s, particularly his 5 collaborations with star Clint Eastwood. 1968's Coogan's Bluff, 1970's Two Mules for Sister Sarah, The Beguiled, and Dirty Harry in 1971, and finally Escape from Alcatraz in 1979. Considering interpretations of Invasion of the Body Snatchers as itself a fundamentally reactionary work, its story of a small rural American town being taken over by an individuality-destroying hive mind standing in for authoritarian communism at the peak of Red Scare paranoia, Dirty Harry in particular casts a pall over the film as not only Siegel's most iconic contribution to North American cinema, but also as one of the most commercially successful and popularly influential works of right-wing cinema at a time when New Hollywood was still steeped in at least a veneer of countercultural critique of conservative morality and politics, spawning the template of cop and vigilante-focused action thrillers for decades to come.
Callahan.
Sir?
I don't want any more trouble like you had last year in the Fillmore district. Understand? That's my policy.
Yeah, well, when an adult male is chasing a female with intent to commit rape, I shoot the bastard. That's my policy.
Intent? How did you establish that?
Well, a naked man is chasing a woman through an alley with a butcher knife and a heart on. I figure he isn't out collecting for the Red Cross.
I think he's got a point.
But we'll leave politics for a little later and just focus on Siegel as a filmmaker. In recent decades, particularly since the publication of Stuart M. Kaminsky's 1974 book, Don Siegel, Director, there's been a significant reappraisal of Siegel from being seen as one of many more or less mercenary, if particularly competent filmmakers working in 40s and 50s film noir, to being recognized as a minor auteur in his own right, at the very least, with a deeply personal vision. In the case of Invasion of the Body Snatchers, Siegel's authorship contributes to both the film's overall quality in terms of direction of both performances and visual aesthetic, as well as its uncommonly visceral effectiveness as a work of both modern science fiction as well as more traditionally gothic horror. Siegel was particularly drawn to the project both as an avenue for breaking out of the westerns and crime thrillers that had been his bread and butter since the end of the Second World War, as well as by how the premise of Finney's book touched him personally. The alien invaders of Finney's novel are plant pods that are evolved to almost completely replicate and then replace the host population of whatever godforsaken planet they end up landing on, taking advantage of them when they are their most vulnerable, when they are asleep. Hence, a large amount of the tension in both The Body Snatchers and its film adaptation hinges upon the compulsion of its fear-stricken characters to stay awake for as long as they can, their deprived and exhausted mental states blurring the line between what is real and what is imagined. This proved a particular draw for Siegel, who was himself a lifetime insomniac, quoting him from Kaminsky's book. The fear of sleeping in the movie is the fear of waking up as a pod, but this fear is very real to chronic insomniacs like me. One of the reasons insomniacs are afraid to sleep is that they fear they won't wake up. The parallel is there. Ironically, at times, I have suffered so much from chronic insomnia that I would have liked to turn into a pod. That last line in particular about the ambivalence towards the idea of being taken over, replaced by some unnatural force, of going to sleep and never waking up, is going to prove particularly helpful for our interpretation of the film, but again, all in due time. According to Finney, as with many of his novels, he had already written The Body Snatchers with an intent that it should be made into a feature film. Rather than recruiting Finney to adapt his own work, however, Wanger hired another novelist and screenwriter, Daniel Mainwaring. Mainwaring was first a successful journalist before turning to a career in literary fiction in the 1930s. He also had a small career in Hollywood, but like Walter Wanger, he quickly got disappointed with how little he was being paid and how few opportunities there were. His own career aligning with Siegel's own typecast genre, Mainwaring became primarily known as a favorite of hard-boiled detective and noir novels. By the end of the Second World War, he had also made significant inroads as a Hollywood screenwriter, again concentrated in noir and detective movies. By far his most famous contribution to American cinema was an adaptation of his own 1946 novel, Build My Gallows High, released in 1947 as Jacques Turner's Out of the Past, frequently cited as one of the greatest noir films of all time. Siegel himself had directed a film previously from a screenplay by Mainwaring, 1949's The Big Steal. He would partner with Siegel again on Babyface Nelson in 1957 and The Gun Runners in 1958. Before 1955, all of Mainwaring's literature and films were credited under the pseudonym Geoffrey Holmes. Preceded in 1955 by the Phoenix City story, Invasion of the Body Snatchers would be the second film to bear the author's legal name. In Michael Chiment's 1985 book Conversations with Losey, the director Joseph Losey is quoted as saying the following about Mainwaring. This is one of the things that makes me very close to Dan Mainwaring. His experience of Americana, the nostalgia of the good things about small towns. I remember the smell of burning leaves at night in the autumn, too, and I remember the smell of Christmas, the sparkle in the air at football games, and the sound of distant trains, and Dan remembers them all. But that reference to Mainwaring's nostalgia fails to communicate the writer's more nuanced politics, which, in itself, the duel of authorship between screenwriter and Siegel as director looming, throws conventional reading of Invasion into dissonance. Though certainly no radical, Mainwaring's liberalism, with its particular emphasis on First Amendment and labor rights, and more specifically opposition towards racial prejudice, was part and parcel with a variant of the Hollywood left that would go into something of a recession with the anti-communist further of the Hollywood blacklist. Though Losey characterized Mainwaring as nostalgic for the sanguine dream of the traditional small American town, in a 1972 seminar on the gangster film held at Northwestern University, Mainwaring is quoted as saying, "Small towns are miserable places, with particular animus towards the hatred that white farmers had for Cesar Chavez and other organizers of migrant labor rights. Small towns are a consistent fixture of both Mainwaring's novels and movies, as are national and racial borders. Whereas we typically associate noir cinema with oppressive skyscrapers and chiaroscuro alleyways, there is just as much to be said for those filmmakers and authors who identified the isolation, tribalism, and fundamentalism of rural communities as ripe for macabre tales of desperate crime, festering corruption, and the erosion of the human spirit under modernity." While not a work of noir per se, Mainwaring's first published novel, 1933's One Against the Earth, concerns a young California ranch hand turned drifter who is unjustly accused and lynched for the murder of a child. Much later, Mainwaring's collaboration with Losey, 1950's The Lawless, depicts a young Latino fruit picker named Paul Rodriguez who ends up being railroaded by both the local police and mainstream newspapers when a racially charged fight is blown out of proportion. The film is heavily inspired by the events of the 1942 Sleepy Lagoon murders, in which 17 Mexican-American youths were convicted of second-degree murder for the late-night death of one Jose Diaz. While the trials themselves became a flashpoint of activism, both for leftists as well as anti-communist liberals, the sensationalist coverage of the trial and its contribution to a sense of an all too familiar fear and paranoia regarding Latino youth as immoral gangsters, goons, and reckless, mad-brained young wolves were also called out for scrutiny, as were the mainstream press's failures to report on the claims by some of the accused that they had suffered brutality at the hands of the police. Though approved by the Production Code Administration, film censor Joseph Breen nonetheless attempted to discourage Paramount Pictures from co-producing and distributing the film, then titled The Outrage, calling it, quote, a very definite disservice to this country of ours and to its institutions and ideals. As Doug Dibburn notes in his contribution to the 2007 book Un-American Hollywood, The Lawless was part of a cycle of post-war films dealing with Latin American characters, settings, and in socio-political themes that went at least some step beyond the objectifying Latin lovers and exoticized global south of pre-war Hollywood. John Ford's The Fugitive, for instance, or Anthony Mann's Border Incident starring Ricardo Montalban, and who could forget Elia Kazan's Viva Zapata. With an eye for left and liberal allegory in particular, however, the film and its depiction of the angry white mob is both consistent with other left and liberal films of the time, as well as prescient of Mainwaring's own adaptation of The Body Snatchers. Quoting Dibburn, because the film reflects the position of a progressive yearning for the idealism of the World War II era, the movie doesn't end with the white mob attacking the innocent Mexican kids. Rather, they attack the newspaper office, and in the context of the film, this is an independent newspaper office, a liberal, sympathetic rag that is actually defending them in the press and trying to question the police account. Rather, they attack the newspaper office, the very symbol of the First Amendment. The angry white mob, like the House Un-American Activities Committee, was trampling on Americans' essential liberties, and the only path left was to regroup and fight as they had done years before. Mainwaring wasn't alone in conceptualizing HUAC as a lawless mob. Cy Enfield's The Sound of Fury, Joseph Mankiewicz's No Way Out, and Russell Roos and Leo Popkin's The Well, all released in 1950 and 1951, also portray angry mobs as manifestations of the fascist tendency that liberals saw as dominating American political life at the time. In each film, a white mob takes the law into its own hands to attack blacks, Mexicans, the working class, or the freedom of the press. End quote. This image of the angry white mob, with its fascistic tendency towards rooting out racial difference and opposing free speech, leads us inevitably towards a countervailing reading of Invasion of the Body Snatchers, not as an allegory for the threat of authoritarian communism, but as an allegory for Red Scare paranoia itself. It is intriguing to speculate on Mainwaring's particular attraction to Finney's novel and adaptation of it from this angle. After all, who are the pod people of the novel but an all-consuming mob of rural whites devoted exclusively to rooting out what last difference there is? Who are our protagonists but individuals who attempt desperately to escape this miserable circumstance to warn society at large, only to find that the institutions of the town itself have been completely taken over, putting a gag, so to speak, on and systematically censoring all dissenting speech. At any rate, Mainwaring's ambivalence toward the supposed wholesomeness of small-town American life sets the stage for the film adaptation's own sense of ambivalence and contradiction, a science fiction yarn, the narrative and aesthetic realization of which is more consistent with film noir, and where it isn't entirely clear whether the horror of the film truly originates from alien forces from without, or is actually just being projected from within, whether it's a dream logic, whether this is a surreal horror. As acknowledged in our previous Bookworms Crypt episode on the novel, Wanger, Siegel, and Mainwaring's film is largely faithful to the source. The changes are largely minute. The psychiatrist Manny Kaufman becomes Daniel Kaufman. Certain scenes are narratively reorganized or condensed. Others are more significant, such as the excision altogether of a sequence in which the protagonist, Dr. Miles Bennett, his love interest Becky Driscoll, and their friends Jack and Teddy flee their small town home to shack up in a motel along the highway, only to return to the town the next morning to try to fight the invasion. The movie doesn't even bother with such an episode. We go straight from them realizing that the pods are taking over to them separating and everything going to the dogs, as it were. Certain changes occur simply due to the functional inability to translate the qualities of Finney's prose narrated from the protagonist Miles' retrospective first-person experience to the much more visual and removed medium of a low-budget film. Though later reshoots to the film would also add in a frame narrative in which Miles, played by Kevin McCarthy, narrates the story in flashback, and while there is a certain degree of psychological subjectivity enhanced by Siegel's tightly focused direction and cinematographer Ellsworth Fredericks' noir visuals, the film itself is unmistakably occurring not from Miles' perspective, but the semi-omniscient perspective of the hypothetical spectator, the film audience themselves watching a movie, sutured into a projected illusion of a consistently defined space and linear sequence that in itself is part and parcel with classical Hollywood filmmaking. The only place where classical Hollywood verisimilitude truly breaks down, ironically, is at the conclusion of the film, when McCarthy briefly breaks the fourth wall to warn the audience, "They're here already! You're next!" And even at this point, the perspective is clear. This is not McCarthy talking to himself. This is McCarthy talking to us as the hypothetical spectator, the true perspective of the film, engaging with the illusion from a space of removed voyeurism. Similarly, aspects of the novel's deteriorating setting that take up a significant preoccupation of Finney's prose, always thematically in the foreground, are relegated to background information and subtle reference. They still inform the film to some extent, but not nearly so significantly. The most obvious example of this is in the romance between Miles and Becky, played in the film by Dana Winter. Again, in the novel, conveyed through Miles' subjective experience, the developing romance between them proves to be not merely some light garnish to an otherwise oppressive story, but a driving source of motivation. The Miles of Finney's book is a much more overtly ambivalent and cynical character than McCarthy's own assured performance as viewed through the classical Hollywood mold, and a good deal of his emotional state at the beginning of the novel is derived from his perception of himself, due to his recent divorce as a failure, so to speak, by the standards of contemporary manhood and masculinity. Becky, also a divorcee, becomes an invaluable source of emotional rejuvenation, as well as a direct assistance when it comes to, say, subduing 4 of the pod people so they can make a getaway near the story's climax. That's another thing. Finney very explicitly mocks Hollywood standards of masculinity. Miles in the book is definitely no action hero. He explicitly says it as much, and then even better, at one point, Becky even says to him, "Yeah, but you're assuming I can't do anything." It's a wonderful bit in the novel, and I hope that was in the original 54 version and not just in the revised, updated edition, but it was definitely one of the better parts of reading the book. The filmmakers do their best to translate that element of the story, the idea of Miles not really being a classical Hollywood action hero, certainly no noir hero in any conventional sense, but again, it doesn't quite break through all of the accumulated conceits we as spectators have regarding how charming, handsome guys like Kevin McCarthy are supposed to be viewed in these life or death circumstances. The romantic plot of the book, thus, is not merely a subplot, it's integral to Miles' entire heroic arc as someone who initially retreats from the call to action, the call to passion, to the call to righteous defiance, but then finds his manhood again. McCarthy and Winter's characters are divorcees as well, and it's acknowledged explicitly in the film, but the same pertinence to a much more removed perspective of the voyeuristic camera. It just doesn't scan. We're left with, unfortunately, precisely that kind of light garnish I talked about before. Their relationship status as characters left up to interesting minutiae that you probably wouldn't notice even after several viewings, that certainly doesn't seem to define McCarthy or Winters' performances or their characters' motivations, and is only incidentally tied into a much more conventionally action-oriented narrative. We would definitely be fair in identifying this angle of the film as merely a subplot, one that only seems to take on a particular narrative resonance once the particular threat of the pod people to the human capacity to love and, more importantly, sexually reproduce is made explicit.
I love Becky. Tomorrow, will I feel the same?
There's no need for love.
No emotion. Then you have no feelings. Only the instinct to survive. You can't love or be loved, am I right?
You say it as if it were terrible. Believe me, it isn't. You've been in love before. It didn't last. It never does. Love, desire, ambition, faith. Without them, life's so simple. Believe me.
I don't want any part of it.
I want to love and be loved. I want your children. I don't want a world without love or grief or beauty. I'd rather die.
What we're left with in the film is two characters whose emotional relationship is too vague to sufficiently register in a story where the central horrific element is bound up in the loss of individuality, the loss of humanity, the loss of emotion. I'm not faulting McCarthy or Winter for this either. They do a fine job, especially when the heat ramps up. They give excellent performances. But just as classical Hollywood filmmaking can never truly translate the unique subjectivity of a third-person novel, it is similarly, in its visual and auditory emphasis, too sensual. It's too engrossed in what appeals to the voyeuristic eye rather than to a sense of emotional longing, a need for personal connection. What McCarthy and Winter's characters have are good looks and sexual chemistry, but in a sinister way, at least before the tyranny of the pod people totally strips them, particularly Miles, of their security as stock archetypes of classical Hollywood gender roles. They communicate only a variation of the same shallow effect that defines the pod people themselves. They are only personalities. They're bereft of emotion and intimate connection to each other, much less to the hypothetical spectator. The same situation goes for how the setting of the small California town, the real-life Mill Valley in the book, and the fictional, more cost-effective Santa Mira of the film physically parallels in its deterioration the descent of the protagonists to their lowest point in the story. In Finney's novel, the pod people, lacking any drive or ambition to continually progress and change, simply leave any non-instrumental aspect of human life to waste away. This culminates in a lengthy sequence in which Miles and Becky wander through the town and observe all the ways in which it's dying, a little at a time, the warning signs of a crisis virtually imperceptible until it's too late. This aspect of the book makes it into the film, but again, what is subjectively foregrounded in Finney's novel becomes only an unfortunate background to Wanger, Siegel, and Mainwaring's film. Indeed, this element of the story is much more neglected than the romance between Miles and Becky, because at least there, the unrequited sexual tension between McCarthy and Winter's characters eventually bears fruit in the film's very sinister climactic twist. In the case of the town itself, on the other hand, references to its neglect and decay appear early in the story, but are never tied together again.
What's the matter? Has Joe been sick?
No, we gave it a stand-up. Too much work.
The boy's panic should have told me it was more than school he was afraid of. And that littered, closed-up vegetable stand should have told me something, too. When I last saw it, less than a month ago, it was the cleanest and busiest stand on the road.
Good evening, Doctor.
What happened to the crowd tonight?
I don't know. It's been this way for 2 or 3 weeks now.
Well, At least we don't have to wait for a table.
Even on a visual level, either because of a lack of inclination or simply because of a lack of sufficient budget, the film version of the story not only doesn't foreground social decay as a narrative element, but hardly even backgrounds it. There are no sequences in the film like in Finney's novel. If anything, the Santa Mira of the film seems just as lively, active, and earnest as it would had there been no invasion of the body snatchers.
Just like any Saturday morning.
A direct consequence of this is that Invasion lacks a certain punch of Finney's novel in terms of conveying the social dimension of the film's horror. Ironically, almost the opposite of the problem with the romantic subplot. The filmmaker's approach to the invasion itself, how it is conveyed to the hypothetical spectator by proxy through Miles as a secondary point of identification, is too personal. It's too emotionally localized. Mainwaring as a writer and Siegel as a director, even working through classical Hollywood artifice and veneer, are much more interested in the closely knit focus on Miles and Becky specifically as this representative couple, this pair of individuals whose passion and humanity is threatened by a dehumanizing force. They neglect, however, entirely the idea of social interdependence, the various extremes background characters and extras coming together to form the town as character, as itself integral to defining humanity. Finney definitely had a much more earnest nostalgia for his resident Mill Valley than Mainwaring has for the miserable Santa Mira, and again, we start to allude to the political ambivalence and dissonance of the film. Because human connection, emotion, love, and codependence are so important, they define what it means to be truly alive and free. But damn this town and everyone in it. Damn society, I say. Damn it. There is no society, I tell you. It's only the family and the individual. You know, there's also some plot elements of the movie that are clearly rooted in Finney's novel, but are just bizarrely reproduced without an essential bit of context. For instance, when Miles, Becky, Jack, and Teddy are all having a barbecue in Miles' backyard, and Miles walks into his greenhouse only to discover 4 pods there and discover that they're replicating the 4 of them, Jack says,
"This must be the way that putty in my closet was formed."
Now, Jack is referencing the first time the characters had encountered a pod person, which is just the night before over at Jack's house, and the pod is replicating Jack. But here's the thing. In the movie, nobody makes any reference to the body being in a closet at some point or being found there. In the book, Jack says that he found the body in his closet before calling Miles. In the movie, what we see is Miles being called up to Jack's place, Jack showing Miles the body on his pool table, and in this entire sequence where it's foreshadowed that the body is replicating Jack, it is never once made reference to where Jack found the body. That's a fairly minor example of how elements of the novel bleed over into the film adaptation without being established in terms of the film's own narrative logic. A much more overt example comes earlier in the film at the point in which Jack and Teddy first take refuge in Miles' home after discovering that the pod has now fully replicated Jack. After calling Dan Kaufman on the phone, Miles is suddenly gripped with terror and drives over to the home of Becky's father, where Becky is living, and he breaks into the basement and finds Becky's own pod person double in the basement replicating her.
I don't know what it was. Call it a premonition, but suddenly I had the feeling that Becky was in danger. I had to get to her as quickly as possible.
Now, remember, the narration of the movie was something that was only added much later, when the decision was made to do reshoots to frame the entire story in flashback. Presumably, in the film's original form, this premonition on Miles' part comes entirely out of the blue. In the novel, on the other hand, Miles' sudden motivation to rescue Becky is much more straightforward. After leaving Jack and Teddy to monitor the body that is replicating Jack, and just before returning Becky to her home, Becky finally, tearfully confides in Miles that she herself has had feelings all along that her own father is an imposter, that she herself is the victim of the mass hysteria gripping Mill Valley. It should come as no surprise at this point that, while a demonstrably well-made film, well-shot, well-directed, compellingly written, and filled with consummate performances by both its main and supporting cast, The Invasion of the Body Snatchers not only changed significant elements of Finney's novel, often in ways that problematized its own story's sense of internal logic, but also changed significantly over the course of its production and post-production. Like many movies in which the studio executives, in this case those at Allied Artists, stepped in and demanded changes to the film that went against its creator's original intent, there has grown an apocryphal legend around the film that frames Wanger, Siegel, and Mainwaring's original vision as something more stark and oppressive, only to be compromised by the cynical studio pods, as Siegel himself later called them. But acknowledging these clear holes in the plot of the film, it seems that the case for this legend is at least a tad overblown. In the case of Miles' sudden premonition to save Becky from the pod people, it was only the studio-mandated frame narrative that gave the filmmakers an avenue for at least nominally papering over a plot hole right at a fairly crucial point in the film's second act, when the tension is ramping up and the pervasive scope of the threat of the pod people is just starting to be acknowledged by the protagonists. On the other hand, in several ways, the filmmakers seem to have been otherwise content to abandon verisimilitude wherever they felt they could get away with it, an approach that comes directly into play near the originally intended terrifying conclusion. As many other critics have noted, whether they have read Jack Finney's book or not, the actual process through which the pod people do not merely form, but specifically replace their individual human hosts is never clarified in the film.
But when they're finished, what happens to our bodies?
I don't know. When the process is completed, probably the original is destroyed or disintegrates. No, wait!
Sorry, but I take a dim view of watching my own destruction take place.
There isn't any danger until they're completely formed. We learned that last night at your house. Your blank didn't change right away.
Not until you fell asleep.
Okay, so there you have a pretty concise, albeit largely hypothetical explanation of pod-person replacement on the part of the characters. Step 1, the individual pod begins the process of replicating a human host. Step 2, while the host is sleeping, the pod person is able to complete its replication of them. Step 3, somehow or other, the pod person either kills, destroys its host, or the host spontaneously disintegrates. As my listener will recall, this is exactly the process of duplication and replacement that Finney makes explicit in his novel. In adapting the novel, however, the filmmakers not only opted to simply not show this process taking place, leaving it up to the imagination of the spectator or whatever, but specifically contrived a climactic twist to the story that fundamentally would contradict it. In the last 20 minutes of the film, Miles and Becky are left the last lovers alive in all of Santa Mira, escaping another attempt of the pod people to assimilate them by the same method as in the book, locking them in Miles' office, placing 2 pods outside their door, and just waiting for them to go to sleep. The 2 characters flee into the hills and take shelter in an old mine, desperately trying to stay awake, knowing that even a moment's rest could just mean their doom. Miles leaves Becky for just a few minutes once he hears music playing beyond the hills. Paralleling the novel, he discovers a field in which assimilated farmers are growing yet more and more pods to be delivered to the outlying towns and cities around Santa Mira. When Miles returns to the cave, he finds Becky on the verge of sleep. Unable to rouse her, they collapse to the dank floor and kiss, at which point Miles realizes the horrific truth. He is too late.
I went to sleep, Miles, and it happened.
Oh, Becky.
They were right.
I should never have left you.
Stop acting like a fool, Miles, and accept us.
No. Never.
He's in here! He's in here! Get him! Get him!
This isn't merely a case of the filmmakers not depicting explicitly how the pods replace people. It's a case of the filmmakers deciding on climaxing their film with a shocking twist that while effective, has no consistency with anything we are shown previously. There is never a point when Miles and Becky are separated long enough for Becky to fall asleep and a pod to completely assimilate her. When Miles takes Dan Kaufman back to the home of Becky's father and shows him the basement where the first doppelganger is growing, the body has disappeared, so it would be possible that it were simply moved. Except then, at the barbecue the next night, there are 4 more pods in Miles' greenhouse, one for each host, including Becky. What's more, in another scene, Miles discovers, in another bit of premonition, this one at least cribbed directly from Finney's novel, he discovers that there are 2 more pods in the trunk of his car. Again, one for himself and one for Becky. When the pair are cornered in Miles' office, there are yet 2 more pods brought for them. In every case, it seems particularly pertinent for the pods to be in some close proximity to their host and be exactly as many as the host. If they can replicate people from literal miles away, the imposters themselves certainly don't act like it, nor do they behave as though they have plenty of pods to spare. Just look to the scene where Miles and Becky witness them distributing pods in the Santa Mira town square to be distributed further throughout the outlying counties, systematically apportioning certain numbers of pods to different people based on relatives or close associates they may have. If there is a pod already in the mine before Miles and Becky arrive there, we certainly are never shown it happening, and what would be the premonitory reason for the pod people putting it in a mine? It certainly didn't grow there. The spores didn't land in the mine. They're not going to be able to root there, or will they? Who knows? The impression that one gets from this twist is not that it is Becky who has disintegrated and been replaced, but rather that it is the pods themselves that seem to arbitrarily replicate their host and then somehow enter into them. Like it's the pods that disappear right after the replication takes place, and now it's literally just you as a pod person. About as far as you can get from modern science fiction besides the superficial content of alien invaders, the only explanation for this event lies in the surreal and supernatural. This is not a scene that is evocative of replacement, it's of possession. This inevitably leads us to the one major difference between Finney's novel and the film adaptation. In The Body Snatchers, both Miles and Becky survive. Their defiance and the implied defiance of many other humans ultimately compelling the rest of the remaining pods to fly into space in order to find a less hostile host population. In the film adaptation, as originally conceived and intended by Wanger, Siegel, and Mainwaring, McCarthy's character simply takes off running, reaching the highway and vainly trying to warn the ignorant mass of drivers of their impending doom. We pull back into a wide shot emphasizing Miles' ant-like impotence in a sea of human traffic, the world of humanity barreling complacently headlong into the night to its own oblivion. The end. While Allied Artists had initially agreed to a $460,000 budget and a 24-day shooting schedule, they later compelled Wanger to renegotiate terms, bumping down the budget to $350,000 and principal photography to 20 days in the months of March and April 1955. Nevertheless, the production ran 3 days over schedule and roughly $32,000 over budget, due in large part to Siegel and cinematographer Ellsworth Frederick's insistence on shooting all of their exterior night scenes at night, rather than opting for the traditional low-budget technique of day for night. The bleak Gothic effect of this choice complemented the filmmaker's emphasis on psychological, borderline, supernatural terror and paranoia, contrasted with the more bombastic, action-oriented narratives that were beginning to proliferate in modern sci-fi cinema. Still, though, such artistic fervor should have done little to impede the studio's plans for the film to be released sometime in the late summer or early autumn of that year, 1955, primed to capitalize upon Finney's best-selling, expanded companion novel as soon as possible. Nonetheless, the film struggled through post-production. First was the problem of that title, The Body Snatchers. Wanger was concerned that the title would confuse the film with the Val Lewton-produced, Robert Wise-directed The Body Snatcher from 1945, and as late as the summer of 1955, when editing of the film was being finalized and test screenings prepared, the filmmakers were still struggling to come up with something evocative and eye-catching. The executives at Allied Artists suggested they came from another world, which itself seems a bit too similar to and was likely inspired by the 1951 Howard Hawks production The Thing from Another World. Siegel submitted his own suggestions, Better Off Dead and Sleep No More. Sound a lot like hard-boiled noir films, don't they? And Wanger, in turn, attempted to compromise with Fatal Sleep, Evil in the Night, World in Danger, The Unknown. Ultimately, Allied Artists stepped in and opted for the only slightly modified, more sensationalist banner, Invasion of the Body Snatchers, which Siegel didn't care for at all. He later told journalist Jim Meyer in a 1966 interview, "Without question, if one paid a bonus to all and sundry for the worst title to be picked, it would have been impossible to have chosen a stupider one than Invasion of the Body Snatchers. It is a cheap title with absolutely the wrong kind of connotation for our picture." But the pods who ruled Allied Artists had final control. Wanger also toyed with the idea of framing the picture with some sort of written preface or narration long before the studio mandated changes to the filmmaker's original cut. At first, he tried to get permission to use a Winston Churchill quotation at the beginning of the film, clearly derived from Finney's own allusions to Churchill's famous "We shall fight them in the field" speech at the conclusion of his novel, not at all appropriate for the bleaker conclusion that they were already going to shoot. Then he tried to court Orson Welles because of his prestigious reputation and probably his still iconic associations with the 1938 radio adaptation of The War of the Worlds, and then he tried courting another best-selling sci-fi author, Ray Bradbury, to do some kind of narration. None of this came to anything. By the end of June and the beginning of July, the original cut of the film was finally ready for test screenings. Information is conflicting on this, even from the individuals involved in the making of the film, as they have been interviewed over the decades, whether it came down to the responses from test audiences or from the pods at Allied Artists, but two things clearly weren't sitting right with the film in its nascent state. First and foremost, as originally written and shot, the film contained many more instances of comic levity, an attempt by Wanger, Mainwaring, and Siegel to disarm the viewer so that when the tension ramped up, the audience would really have the rug pulled out from under them. Instead, however, it seemed either that the audiences weren't taking the film seriously enough, laughing in the wrong places, or the executives at Allied Artists heard sound recordings of the test audiences laughing at the right moments and said, "Full stop, we want to sell a scary picture, no laughing, cut the funny bits out." At any rate, a new cut of the film was prepared and screened in August, but again, it did not go well. Again, accounts are conflicting, but in either case, whether it came down to the test audiences or the studio pods, one thing was certain: something had to be done about that bleak conclusion. There was also still the problem that the test screenings in June and July had revealed, that test audiences' number one complaint was they were having trouble following the movie. Apparently, certain elements of the plot felt somewhat muddled and unclear. Ultimately, Allied Artists insisted that reshoots be scheduled for September to create a new frame story that begins with the hysterical Miles being held in custody at a city hospital and telling his story to a sympathetic psychiatrist played by our good pal Whit Bissell, and ending with the at first skeptical authorities getting the sudden news that makes them realize that Miles was telling the truth.
What have we here?
Ran his truck through a red light. Greyhound bus smacked him broadside and tipped him over.
Put him in the OR. Will you take over Bunnell for me, Doctor?
Certainly.
How badly is he hurt?
Both legs, left arm, broken all to bits. We had to dig him out from under the most peculiar things I ever saw.
What things?
Well, I don't know what they are. I never saw them before. They look like great big seed pods.
Seed pods?
Where was the truck coming from?
Santa Mira.
Get on your radio and sound on all points along. Block all highways, stop all traffic, and call every law enforcement agency in the state. Operative, get me the Federal Bureau of Investigation.
Wanger had to beg Siegel to come back and do the reshoots himself. He absolutely hated the idea of this whole bleak, noirish, paranoid thriller the three of them had crafted suddenly ending with, of all people, the spooks at the FBI being called in to stop the invasion of the body snatchers. Many fans, historians, and scholars have similarly bemoaned this deus ex machina climax, acknowledging Siegel's phoned-in approach to filming it a total letdown after the originally intended borderline confrontational finale with McCarthy screaming at the audience in terror and being engulfed in darkness. But Bill Warren, author of Keep Watching the Skies, offers a rare dissenting opinion, arguing that the frame narrative of the movie, even with the conventional authorities rushing to the rescue, doesn't really undermine the bleakness of the film that much. After all, the film is only ending with a confirmation and acknowledgement of Miles' story, but what it is absolutely not doing is articulating a clearly optimistic conclusion. The ending is still wide open. Nobody knows what happens next, and even still ends with a close-up of McCarthy, completely exhausted and paralyzed with uncertainty, leaning against the wall, drenched in sweat, tears welling up in his eyes. Still pretty harrowing stuff, at least I felt so when I saw it as a kid. But Warren also offers his own critique of the original ending, that breaking the fourth wall was potentially one of those moments where, in the test screenings, the spectators were laughing at the wrong moments, that its effective distanciation actually took them out of the picture. In the final cut, the dissolve from the originally intended final wide shot of the highway to the hospital is potentially necessary to return the spectator to a state of unease derived from identification with the symbolic order of the narrative itself, structured in ways that are aesthetically and narratively conventional and familiar, while at the same time, again, offering no clear source of catharsis. Miles has been vindicated, it's proven he's not insane, sure, but just as with the patients who had needed Miles' help and those of his friend Danny previously, the issue isn't really their being acknowledged or taken seriously. The issue is the imposters, the pod people. The horror is still there. In Susan Sontag's book of essays Against Interpretation from 1966, there's a piece called The Imagination of Disaster. In it, Sontag attempts a systematic critique of the science fiction film genre as it had developed between 1951 and 1965 when she wrote the essay. She begins by outlining two main formulaic scripts to most of these science fiction films, ones they strictly adhere to, divided between the more expensive, widescreen color films and the lower-budget black and white productions, like, say, Invasion of the Body Snatchers. The first script proceeds in 5 steps. First, we get the arrival of the thing, the monster, or aliens, usually witnessed by just one person, usually single and some kind of scientist whose account isn't taken seriously. Next, we get some kind of event with more witnesses that confirm the hero's report. The conventional authorities are called in and are either unable to deal with it or are massacred. Step 3 usually takes place in a capital city or some other seat of authority. There are conferences between scientists and military. The hero lectures the authorities. National emergency ensues as there is more atrocity and destruction. A large, sometimes international response is mounted. In step 4, this response usually fails or is insufficient. There's more destruction, and at this point, the hero's girlfriend, if he has one, usually ends up in a position of being particularly threatened. Finally, we get to step 5. We have some more conferences. The hero works out the one weakness of the thing or some unorthodox solution to the cosmic force. And finally, we get some wondrous bit of technology, usually a really powerful weapon that is able to repulse the threat. The hero gets the girl, but everyone stands vigilant for when the threat may come back. The second script, the lower budget production, is necessarily shorter, and the circumstances are thus usually more banal, the setting less exotic. Radiation often plays a bigger role in these stories. Step 1, our hero, again, often a scientist of some kind, witnesses the thing. Step 2, the authorities don't believe him, and sometimes whoever he does have faith in turns out to get killed or get taken over by the thing. Step 3, wanton death and destruction. Things seem totally hopeless. Step 4, either the hero does battle alone and solves the crisis, or he finally finds competent authorities to deal with it. Sontag further offers 3 variations of these 2 scripts. In one, it's the scientists themselves operating from their own prosperous home laboratory who create the monsters or become the monsters. Again, radiation often plays a big role. In the second variation, instead of a discrete monster or alien invaders, the threat is conceived of as, quote, some fundamental alteration in the conditions of existence on our planet, end quote. Again, radiation often plays a big role. And in the third variation, instead of taking place on the Earth, the story involves an expedition of discovery into space. It's the alien place that is in dire state of emergency, or the spaceship that becomes host to the destructive thing. More or less everything about the previous 2 scripts remains the same. They just, take place in space and end with the heroes making a desperate moonshot back to the safety and comfort of Earth. Invasion of the Body Snatchers satisfies both these scripts in a number of ways, albeit presented in a slightly more nuanced, cerebral fashion. Step 1, Miles, our scientist. Hey, a doctor is a kind of scientist. There's a scientific discipline involved. Step 1, the scientist has already witnessed the arrival of the thing, and nobody in a position of authority believes him.
I'm Dr. Hill from the State Mental Hospital.
I'm not insane!
Let him go!
Listen, doctor, now you must listen to me. You must understand me. I'm a doctor, too. I am not insane. I am not insane.
I mean, technically, in Invasion, we get several variations of Step 1, the second with Miles himself being the person in authority, doubting the other people who are witnessing the thing, then the tables being turned when Danny tries to convince him that he himself is a victim of mass hysteria. Step 1 of Invasion of the Body Snatchers takes up 36 minutes of an 80-minute movie.
So your mind started playing tricks, and reality became unreality. The dead man became Jack's double in your eyes.
Look, come off it, will you, Danny?
I know, Miles, this is all hard to believe, but these things happen, even to witch doctors like me.
I saw her here. She was real.
You saw her all right in every tiny detail, as vividly as anyone has ever seen anything, but only in your mind.
Indeed, there's a blurring of the line between the steps, and we don't need to understand this in terms of a post hoc structure that the filmmakers weren't aware of. We can just boil it down to the difference between common sense, conventional dramatic film structure and a particularly effective deployment of these conventions. Mainwaring does a really deft job of blurring the line between the acts of his story, toying with the spectator's anxieties, taking his time to tease out suspense rather than following some thudding, telegraphed plot beats. The steps flow together very organically. For example, technically Step 2 of the second script is followed to the T, we just don't realize it until we're deep into Step 3, the wanton destruction and increasing sense of hopelessness. In Step 2, about 30 minutes into the film, Danny is already a pod person. But this fact doesn't pay off until the late point of Step 3, about 30 minutes later, where, to boot, Jack will also have been taken over by the enemy.
Jack, thank God. Jack, the whole town's been taken over by the pods.
Not quite. There's still you and Becky. Miles, it would have been so much easier if you'd gone to sleep last night.
Now relax. We're here to help you.
Finally, Step 4, this being one of those lower-budget black and white productions, Miles flees into the city, tying us back into the frame narrative where we began, and setting the stage for the ostensibly competent authorities to respond.
You don't believe a word of this, do you? Sure, it's fantastic, but it happened. Don't just sit there measuring me for a straitjacket. Do something! Get on the phone! Call for help!
Now, you may be asking yourself, why am I hearing about Susan Sontag? Why is this guy talking about some egghead with her flattened, nuance-destroying summary of sci-fi movies? Well, first of all, Sontag was not an egghead. I highly encourage anyone listening to read Against Interpretation, particularly The Imagination of Disaster, because Sontag herself seems to have been quite a fan of this early cycle of sci-fi movies, with a comprehensive reading of them. Her reading of these many films only appears flattening if we fail to understand what she is doing, which is that she's attempting to analyze this cycle of films not as discrete works rooted in either cynically capitalistic or authentically creative intent, but rather as a distinct genre that is bound together both by semantic elements, aliens and mutant monsters, scientists and military men, space exploration, advanced technology, and radioactive weapons, but also a commonly discernible syntax, a specific kind of narrative that gives expression to particular contemporarily relevant themes concerning fears of social isolation, the existential threats of nuclear weapons and radiation to humanity, distrust towards conventional authority. We talk a lot in this podcast about the difficulty of trying to engage in a deeper analysis of these films in the absence of materials that point to the clear or explicit intent of the creators. But the importance of genre theory, the type of analysis that Sontag is engaging in, is that it allows us to understand works of various mediums as not, after all, being the exclusive and unique products of individual minds, but as being highly informed by shared political, cultural, and social circumstances. As with lots of works, attempts to read both Jack Finney's novel and Wanger, Siegel, and Mainwaring's film inevitably comes up against the creators themselves, who almost seem to get defensive about or outright mock those critics who read too much into things. In particular, political readings of the film, whether we understand the invasion of the pods to be an expression of Red Scare paranoia or the threat of authoritarian communism, or, on the other hand, representing the mob mentality of the McCarthy era, these have been rejected by both Finney and Siegel. Here I'm quoting Finney from a series of 1975 correspondences with the scholar Arthur Lagasse. For years now, I've been amused by the fairly widely held notion that The Body Snatchers has anything to do with the Cold War, McCarthyism, conformity, Hellmanism, or Fletcherism. It does not. The book isn't a Cold War novel or a metaphor for anything. I wrote it to entertain its readers, nothing more. I suspect that when the picture was made, that is exactly what the filmmakers had in mind also. Later, when people began seeing meanings which aren't really there, I think maybe some of the people concerned with the picture blushed modestly and just didn't deny it. For Siegel's part, he has also denied that the film is political in nature, either right-wing or left-wing, instead emphasizing his personal connection to its subject matter as someone who suffered from insomnia, as well as the applicability of the film's sense of paranoia, the fear of humanity and emotion being sacrificed to inscrutable, cynical forces of life bereft of meaning, to a broad range of phenomena which the audience can attach their own particular experiences. The problem is that, as Lagasse himself notes, and as we ourselves can substantiate by taking cue from Sontag and noting the film's myriad generic similarities to other films produced contemporaneously, is that Invasion of the Body Snatchers, just like its source novel, is clearly responding to anxieties that cannot be disaggregated from politics, that are particular to a specific historical moment and the nation that it came out of. Though individually speaking well made, the narrative of Invasion of the Body Snatchers proves to be not terribly unique in the light of the science fiction film genre at all. Just in our own survey of films, we've encountered numerous examples of films, especially those involving extraterrestrials, in which a threat is derived from the idea of human beings being taken over and corrupted from within. Invaders from Mars, Donovan's Brain, The Quatermass Experiment, I Was a Teenage Werewolf, The Brain from Planet Arrows, Kaltiki, and in particular, the specific fear of our neighbors and loved ones, right down to the evocative image of the hero's girlfriend being replaced by an imposter, is paralleled overtly by It Came from Outer Space 3 years before. Similarly, the fear of scientists, or at least physicians themselves, being arms of this corruption and contamination, and of conventional authority being powerless to do anything, or similarly complicit in this contamination, that's generic as well. We frequently notice in this podcast the porousness between the supposedly modern science fiction films of the 50s and the traditions of Gothic horror, the extent to which it is often difficult to discern whether the sense of threat and horror in a film is merely being projected onto a discrete monster or alien outsider, or whether it is in fact rooted in monstrosity emanating from the corruption within humanity itself. In an indirect way, Sontag offers us an explanation as to why this might be the case, again, viewing this cycle of sci-fi films through a purely generic analysis. Despite the terminology used to assign and categorize them, Sontag argues, as opposed to Golden Age science fiction literature, quote, "Science fiction films are not about science." For Sontag, the mere act of attempting to translate the semantics of a literary genre to the primarily visual and auditory, as well as conventionally shorter medium of cinema, necessarily sacrifices interpretation and written elaboration in favor of the immediate representation and the, quote, sensuous elaboration of something. Expanding on that first quote, science fiction films are not about science. They are about disaster. In science fiction films, disaster is rarely viewed intensively. It is always extensive. It is a matter of quantity and ingenuity. If you will, it is a question of scale. Thus, the science fiction film is concerned with the aesthetics of destruction, with the peculiar beauties to be found in wreaking havoc, making a mess. And it is in the imagery of destruction that the core of good science fiction film lies. Unquote. Now, you may be saying, but Ian, there is no destruction in Invasion of the Body Snatchers. There are no laser beams, no giant guns, no ruined cities. Hell, the aliens themselves are specifically pacifistic. They don't want to hurt anybody, and they don't. But there is extensive destruction in the film. It's just that the destruction occurs again on a gothic level. It occurs on a sensuous level. It occurs to the very nature of humanity. And as to the absence of physical violence, the pod people are nonetheless extensive in the disaster they inflict, as well as ingenious in how they go about it, by attacking us from the inside, by destroying society from the inside out rather than the outside in. And however we may quibble on certain points of how we define destruction, Sontag is absolutely correct if we apply her terms to Invasion of the Body Snatchers versus Finney's novel. Wanger, Siegel, and Mainwaring's film is not about science. It's not just that the process by which the pods replicate and replace human beings is vague to the point of being supernatural. It's that the entire speeches in the book explaining the process by which the spores got here and their biology, the fate of the world as a result, are either significantly condensed or excised altogether, and it's mostly the latter. It is that Dan Kaufman merely diagnoses Miles as a victim of mass hysteria, as opposed to how in the novel he engages him in a prolonged historical framing of mass hysteria that's laden with factual materials. Siegel didn't have the budget to make an explosive alien invasion movie on the level of The War of the Worlds, for instance, but he likely wouldn't have if he wanted to. But the fact remains that his direction is almost entirely sensual, to a personalized degree that was seldom replicated by other filmmakers working in the same cycle of films. As the film gets darker, the characters also get sweatier and dirtier. The longer they stay awake, the looser the narrative logic of the film becomes, until its noir aesthetics culminate in the psychosexual twist in the cave, Siegel employing reverse point of view shots as Miles pulls away from kissing the frigid alien Becky. We don't see any disintegrations, but destruction of the mind is destruction nonetheless, and the sensualism of Invasion of the Body Snatchers eventually reaches a point of modest surrealism, informed entirely by pathological drives, desires, and phobia. But as with Finney's novel, there is a duality and ambivalence towards this destruction, further emboldened and enhanced by the cinema's sensual appeal. Sontag continues, and I'm quoting liberally here, "For science fiction films may also be described as a popular mythology for the contemporary negative imagination about the impersonal. The otherworld creatures that seek to take us over are an it, not a they. If they are human in form, then they obey the most rigid military discipline and display no personal characteristic whatsoever. And it is in this regime of emotionlessness, impersonality, or regimentation that they impose on the earth if they are successful. It is scarcely a black and white situation. The attitude of the science fiction film toward depersonalization is mixed. On the one hand, they deplore it as the ultimate horror. On the other hand, certain characteristics of the dehumanized invaders, modulated and disguised, such as the ascendancy of reason over feelings, the idealization of teamwork, and the consensus-creating activities of science, a marked degree of moral simplification, are precisely traits of the savior scientist." Unquote. For Sontag, the scientists of modern science fiction films are variations of the wizards and sorcerers of classical eras, just as the imagery of worlds colliding and cities being laid waste are modern variations of biblical and mythological disasters born of divine justice. There is white magic and black magic, good science and bad science, and what is good is typically defined by its utility, its unemotional and rational response to an externalized threat, whereas what is bad is rooted in the unproductive and eccentric, in those scientists who neglect their families, their neighbors, their comrades, in order to drink deep the cup of destructive, uncertain knowledge. But this emphasis on utility, on regimentation, on moral simplicity that frames an opposition between both industrially and sexually productive humanity and this mutant freak and the bad scientist who works with them, it necessarily makes humanity more like the pods, more like purely sensualized beings operating by rote and the shallow effect of emotion, rather than being grounded in any authentic connection or aspiring to a higher meaning. Whereas the fear of death and the need for a righteous God informs the romanticism of your biblical or historical epic and all of their own sensuous disasters, the context of modern science fiction for Sontag is much more grim and alienated. It's informed not just by a fear of death, but a fear of collective existence in the shadow of the nuclear arms race being destroyed, the preservation of the individual psyche under the immense pressures of capitalist modernity being undermined. Through these films, whether the destruction is only externally extensive or only internally ingenious, we are allowed a, quote, dispassionate aesthetic view, unquote, of our own deaths and the death of the modern world around us, the release from normal obligations. At the same time, the moral simplicity of these films flattens context and delivers us to a catharsis, typically defined by conventional authority amassing itself just in time to fend off the externalized threat, upon which we have conveniently projected all of our own failures and anxieties. The modern world has created incalculable, potentially apocalyptic horrors in the form of the bomb and radiation, through its increasing emphasis on rationality and dispassionate regimentation. But the very same mechanisms in the generic sci-fi film can also be the solution to all of our problems. We can't help but think back to that evocative quote from Don Siegel in this context, can we? The part where he says, "At times I have suffered so much from chronic insomnia that I would have liked to turn into a pod." Indeed, referring to another Siegel quote, it may not even be the case of the invaders already being here and us being next. At a certain juncture, the pressures of contemporary life become so strenuous, so horrific, it can feel like the only outlet is to embrace the hive mind, to embrace the solemnity of the rote and the artificial, to embrace denial and death. Sontag concludes her essay, quote, "Ours is indeed an age of extremity, for we live under continual threat of two equally fearful but seemingly opposed destinies, unremitting banality and inconceivable terror. It is fantasy served out in large rations by the popular arts which allows most people to cope with these twin specters. For one job that fantasy can do is to lift us out of the unbearably humdrum and to distract us from terrors, real or anticipated, by an escape into exotic, dangerous situations which have last-minute happy endings. But another of the things that fantasy can do is to normalize what is psychologically unbearable, thereby inuring us to it. In one case, fantasy beautifies the world, in the other, it neutralizes it. The fantasy and science fiction films does both jobs. The films reflect worldwide anxieties, and they serve to allay them. They inculcate a strange apathy concerning the processes of radiation, contamination, and destruction, which I, for one, find haunting and depressing. The naive level of the films neatly tempers the sense of otherness, of alienness with the grossly familiar. There is a sense in which all these movies are in complicity with the abhorrent. They neutralize it, as I have said. In these films, we have to do with things which are quite literally unthinkable. Here, thinking about the unthinkable becomes, however inadvertently, itself a somewhat questionable act from a moral point of view. The films perpetuate cliches about identity, volition, power, knowledge, happiness, social consensus, guilt, responsibility, which are, to say the least, not serviceable in our present extremity. But collective nightmares cannot be banished by demonstrating that they are intellectually and morally fallacious. This nightmare is too close to reality." Unquote. I suppose we should count ourselves lucky that, as artists, Wanger, Siegel, and Mainwaring did not give in, did not relent. Regardless of whether or not we are speaking of the intended ending of the of the film or the studio-mandated one given to us by the supposed pods, as Siegel characterizes them, regardless, we are talking about, as with Menzies' Invaders from Mars, an example of that sensuous cinema of destruction that presents us with all of the technical qualities of escapism, but leaves us longing for its prerequisite wish fulfillment. The nightmare is, as Sontag concludes, too close to reality. Indeed, it is reality, and therefore, morally speaking, it must persist. Damn it, Ian, what is all this bullshit about the bomb? There is no bomb in Invasion of the Body Snatchers. There's no radiation. It's a movie about plant monsters from space. What does any of this have to do with the bomb?
Well, what is it? What's going on?
I don't know. A strange neurosis, evidently contagious. An epidemic mass hysteria. In 2 weeks, it spread all over town.
Well, what causes it?
Worry about what's going on in the world, probably.
Well, what is going on in the world of 1956? Probably. We are just now beginning to realize that nuclear weapons radically alter our existence. Nothing we do or feel in working, playing, and loving, and in our private, family, and public lives is free of their influence. The threat they pose has become the context for our lives, a shadow that persistently intrudes upon our mental ecology. That's a quote pulled from psychiatrist Robert J. Lifton and activist Richard Falk's 1982 book, Indefensible Weapons, The Political and Psychological Case Against Nuclearism. Lifton's studies and literature specializes in the psychological causes and effects of war. He was an influential proponent of the controversial field of psychohistory, which attempts to interpret trends in history through a psychoanalytical lens. Speaking of pod people, his most famous book is probably Thought Reform and the Psychology of Totalism from 1961, a book on the so-called brainwashing tactics that can occur in totalitarian societies. Needless to say, Lifton saw the applications of what he preferred to call thought reform as having, implications just as relevant to contemporary American life as it did to authoritarian communism. In Indefensible Weapons, Lifton and Falk claimed that the nuclear age had a profound influence on collective psychology, particularly a sense of emotional paralysis and numbness in the face of an all-encompassing threat that seems to eclipse any hope for the future, a future for the world, our families, even ourselves. Such a sense of helplessness, Lifton and Falk claimed, further influenced a culture inwardly drawn, more towards fundamentalism, narcissism, and denial. The threat of the bomb is not just a threat of explosion or the incineration of buildings and all-consuming apocalyptic fire. It is also the threat of radiation, of the contamination and fundamental corruption of the human body and the environment. And as the threat proliferates in all its forms, it is also a contamination of the mind and of the soul. It heightens our tribalism and xenophobia as the stakes of conflict themselves become exponentially heightened, and it perpetuates our sense of paranoia and distrust, especially when it turns out that those in positions of conventional authority, though we may have had subtle suspicions of it before, are actively lying to us about the sheer scope of the dangers facing us, not from without, but from within. In the immediate post-war period, information to the American public about nuclear weapons and the potential impact of radiation was heavily controlled and highly propagandized. Films and literary resources from the government during this period tended to focus on, as Cindy Hendershot puts it, quote, the safety of bomb shelters and on the sunny side of the atom, unquote. As we have seen previously in touching upon such educational films as Duck and Cover, as well as The House in the Middle, these resources also emphasize the necessity for citizens to treat the threat of the nuclear bomb as an impetus for personal accountability and productivity, to know what to do, how to prepare, and most importantly, how to go on with your normal lives. Keep working, keep shopping, keep our neighborhoods tidy, just going on as if everything is normal. As the byline on the cover of one nuclear preparedness book proclaimed, pod-like in my opinion, if there's atomic warfare, this book may save your life. A simple, easy-to-read guide for every home, office, or factory. Jesus, that's bleak. The book, 1950's How to Survive an Atomic Bomb, also offers this choice quote. Much of the danger of radioactivity is mental.
I want you to realize that. Think about it. And then you'll know that the trouble is inside you.
The first instance of a popularly available text reporting on the significant dangers of radiation came in the form of No Place to Hide, published in 1948, a memoir written by David Bradley, formerly of the Radiological Safety Section monitoring bomb tests in the Bikini Atoll. In the book, Bradley found that the Navy servicemen he encountered at that time failed to take the threat of radiation seriously. The reason had to do, fundamentally, with the fact that radiation itself and its effects were invisible. They could not process all of the immense safety concerns being imposed on them in concrete terms. Thus, their conception in the minds of the sailors became almost supernatural. Compelled to hide from an invisible enemy, receiving only piecemeal information from the so-called experts of all the long-term health effects of radiation, they became preoccupied with impotence and sterilization, the loss of manhood. This finding was echoed by various other post-war sources. In turn, a measure of compensatory manhood and machismo arose in military culture. Like the strongman heroes of so many post-war science fiction films, these servicemen could prove their manhood by showing their willingness to engage with the deadly radiation. Scientists, in all of their protective gear, with all of their whiny precautions, they were the cranky old maids. They weren't real men. Bradley characterized the crisis of the nuclear age as an internal rather than an external one, but not internal as the mind, as how to survive an atomic bomb attempted to insinuate. The authorities who should be protecting American citizens were actually the source of the invisible enemy, and they were actively lying about the extent of the dangers that this enemy posed, allowing casual misinformation and a culture of denial to proliferate. In his 1954 book, In the Name of Sanity, Lewis Mumford went one further, predicting that the United States government and military's proliferation of nuclear weapons and experiments with nuclear technology and radioactivity would eventually lead deleteriously to a form of sadistic fascism, in which the citizen would become increasingly depersonalized, a host subject to any kind of experiment and gallows treatment. For Mumford, the only solution was for a multipliable but fundamentally individual assertion of humanitarian values, especially with regards to one's own humanity. As Cindy Hendershot notes in her 1998 essay, The Invaded Body, this imperative to assert one's own humanity in implicitly masculine individualist terms against an invisible enemy is a hallmark of early studies into paranoid thinking. We already discussed very, very briefly in the Bookworm's Crypt episode on Finney's novel the basis of Capgras delusion, the paranoid thinking exploited in the novel in which a patient believes that some, many, or all those people around them that they encounter have been replaced by identical imposters. In such delusional cases, patients cannot articulate in terms that are visible to anyone else how they know someone is an imposter. They just know. The imposter may be their closest loved one, and they may look, talk, behave, and remember exactly the same as before, but there's still something else there, or something absent that gives them away. Throughout the early 20th century, studies into paranoid cases frequently found that such individuals were also frequently convinced that these fleeting improvised men were also out to change them, to spread their invisible contamination, and then, especially among male subjects, most famously in the case of Daniel Paul Schreiber's 1903 book Memoirs of My Nervous Illness, to unman the subject, to fundamentally change them from man into something queer and feminine, a receptacle to be used and abused, compelled only to make others like itself. This fear of bodily alteration, an outwardly invisible one, is a fear that maintains salience in the context of the nuclear age, as increasingly rife as it is with emotional paralysis, confusion, and paranoia. This paranoia found special distillation in that period's distinct exercising genre, the post-war science fiction movie. Invasion of the Body Snatchers, it intersects with numerous other phenomena of popular conspiracy theory as they developed throughout the late 40s and early 50s. Brainwashing, secret societies, water fluoridation, UFO hysteria. But the backbone of this period's paranoia, the most all-encompassing, the most inscrutable, both because it is both so clearly evident, so openly a production of our untrusted authorities, and yet its effects so invisible, that backbone of paranoia remains the bomb. However, understated, the film is the story of a man whose marriage has failed, a man without children, a man who is under threat of contamination from some invisible enemy, descending not from the stars, but out of the skies, from those ominous-looking clouds those ominous-looking clouds in the opening credits of the movie. That's how it opens. This invisible force that wants to sap Miles of his humanity, to unman him, to transform him into something queer and mutant, an elaborate puppet of some death cult mind. Nobody may mention the bomb or radiation explicitly, just as they may not mention distrust with the government or modern psychiatry explicitly. But the paranoia is there. It's the foundational drive that composes the aesthetics and the narrative arc of the film. And it links to contemporary realities and pervasive social concerns, not merely pet conspiracy theories. This is far from vague stuff. It's not universally applicable. This is a unique production of post-war nuclear paranoia. Understated and ingenious, the destruction nonetheless explodes sensually from Wanger, Siegel, and Mainwaring's compromised film. Like the perfect paranoid fantasy, it culminates in the subject's assertion of his own humanity, his manhood, and finally, its acknowledgement by authority. The only question remains, is this multipliable but fundamentally individual assertion enough? Or is this merely its own compensatory exercise, a denialist turn inward? The same sensual catharsis and thus assimilation as the more typical film, but a slightly more ingenious method of it. What will happen to Miles Bennell? What will become of the last real man in Santa Mira?
Oh my God! Oh my God! Lock the door! Lock the door!
They're coming! They're coming! Help! Help! They're coming! They're coming! Listen to me! Listen! Help me! You're next, please! Please! You're next! We're in danger! Please, listen to me! Something terrible! Please! You're next! Here they are! They're already here! Come! You're next! They're coming! They're coming!
Must have done something.